Wonderful. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is my pleasure to invite you to this presentation of a multi-year incredible project that I am so very, very proud of the work that was done by this Resiliency Ad Hoc Committee. A little bit of background, it was a little over 3 years ago where I was invited by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is really an international group that is been doing a tremendous amount of work in climate change and resiliency. And they invited all the coastal mayors from the country to Southern New Hampshire for a weekend of brainstorming. And after that weekend where, really listened to other mayors and the fact that we're all sharing and dealing with a lot of the same issues, those who are coastal mayors, it became very clear to me that it was time to organize an ad hoc committee and begin pulling together a climate resiliency plan for the city of Newburyport. And that's what will be presented to you tonight, an overview of the plan. The plan is also available on the city website. It's a fairly comprehensive, but I would encourage you to take time to explore the plan, and you'll get a high-level review today. So I just wanted to take a moment and thank Michael Morse, who's the author, primary author and co-chair of the committee, David Chatfield, also our co-chair, who kept us on track throughout all of the massive work that was before us. City Councilor at Large Barry Connell, Molly Ettenborough, our sustainability manager, Julia Goffredson, conservation administrator, Chris Leclerc, our fire chief, William Mullen, resident, John O'Connell, a Newbury resident, Lise Reed, our parks director, and Joe Texera, who is our Conservation Commission chair, as well as John Eric White, our city engineer. Many of those members are here tonight. So we will run through this agenda. I just told you who the Resiliency Committee is, and then I will kick it over to David Chatfield, co-chair of the Resiliency Committee, to take us through the framework and a few other of the agenda items before our planning director, Andy Port, who also a key person in this initiative, will run us through a series of slides talking about the different components of the plan. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Mayor. The Resiliency Committee, we had a mission statement, and basically it said we were going to develop a plan, and then also we were going to advocate for and oversee implementation of adaptation strategies. Next slide, if I could. The plan itself consists of climate change hazards, vulnerabilities, adaptation strategies, and implementation. For those of you that want an overview, there's a 4-page executive summary. For those of you who want to dive deeper, there are 48 pages of appendices. And you can also go to the city website and look for some of the plans that we did. In terms of those steps for the resiliency plan development, we went through a number of planning efforts. Members participated in the multi-hazard mitigation study that's run under a FEMA framework. There was a flood resiliency plan that was done under the auspices of the EPA. Members participated in the Great Marsh Adaptation Plan. And then specifically, the state was looking for a MVP process, a municipality vulnerability analysis, and that was done in Newburyport. And there were other studies, including participation by Harvard Public School, came and helped us look at community rating systems, etc. So we've got this implementation of adaptation strategies to do. Next slide. So let's go back to the hazards and the climate change hazards that we took a look at. Sea level rise, and sea level rise really, which is driven by melting icebergs and thermal expansion. I think it's about 52% to 38% on those two, and then there's a couple of other other things that contribute to sea level rise. We know that that is coming. We know that that's going to be 6 foot in Newburyport at some time. What we don't know is what that timeline is. So sea level is coming. Coastal storms, we're going to see with coastal storms, and we've already seen an increasing frequency of storms and an increasing intensity of storms. If you look at the National Climate Assessment, that's what that's telling us, particularly in the Northeast. Precipitation, heavy precipitation events. In fact, if you look at a period of say 50 years, we've actually gone up in this area of the Northeast, 71% increase in precipitation. So if you put storms and rain and sea level rise together, obviously flooding is a climate change hazard. We've seen that flooding is occurring over the years, and we can expect that flooding hazard to be there and increase. With the coastal storms, there's wind. We know that we're going to have more storms and therefore more wind hazards. Tornadoes, they're probably the only bright spark there. The tornadoes do occur in our area, but they are at low frequency, and there's no real expectation of increases there. Weather extremes, and I think we've seen over the last 5 years, the weather extremes that have occurred with that meandering jet stream, where sometimes it's hot and sometimes it's cold. We're going to see drought, but we're also going to have heavy precipitation when it does come to us. We're going to have heat waves, and we're going to have cold snaps. And I think the Texas thing is a message. You know, in Texas, they're struggling to deal with the cold, just like we would struggle to deal with the heat. So we're going to get the heat, and maybe we should just swap around. So there's a variety of climate change hazards. We went into a little deeper than that. We added on, looking at the change in temperatures and therefore insects and how they would change, making us look as if it were at least 2 states different over the next couple of decades, and consequent change in insects. And we even looked at some of the other impacts like CSOs. So with that, with all those change, can I hand it over to you, Andy, to take it further forward?
Thank you, David. Hopefully folks can all hear me. My name is Andy Port. I am the Director of Planning and Development for the City of Newburyport. My role with this presentation now will be to focus on some visuals to walk you through some of the key vulnerabilities and some of the adaptation strategies that are mentioned in the plan. As David mentioned, the plan is lengthy. There's lots of wonderful information in there and background that folks should be familiar with. But what we've attempted to do here is to consolidate down the substance of that report into some bullets and some visuals to help you understand what is conveyed in that report. So I'm going to go through those now. I will note, by the way, that we will add this presentation to the website along with the plan tomorrow, so that folks who are interested can see these again. So no need to worry as I flip through a number of images. The key vulnerabilities that we have as further from where David left off are generally flooding of residential, commercial, and public areas, our public water supply, vulnerabilities to that, which we'll get into a little bit in the visuals, vulnerabilities to our wastewater treatment facility. Some of that, some of you are already familiar with that, and we'll explore that a little bit. And then the electrical substation. So obviously electrical supply key right now, it's winter, for instance, losing electricity at a time like this would be difficult. So going beyond that, we're gonna step into that in a little bit finer grain. And so this is a visual, some of these visuals, I wanna thank others, by the way, there's a number of others on the committee and staff who have pulled together a number of the visuals in this. I've taken the time to put them into a logical sequence, but many folks, including the city engineer, some of the committee members and others have spent a significant amount of time putting together these great visuals to help us understand how climate change, and particularly sea level rise and flooding may impact the city. So this particular image right here showing the neighborhoods vulnerable to flooding. For those of you who can visualize, the city of Newburyport, we have the downtown area right here and the historic area extending east and west, and I-95. And so what you'll see here is the business park is this area right here. And that, as you can see, there's a fair amount of, routine or regular flooding that happens there. And the idea here is that with worst case scenario, with storm surge during a storm, flooding can be exacerbated, pushed further. And that's where we see this mapping help to show what happens during scenarios, hurricane scenarios. So this map shows some of the areas of vulnerability. You'll notice in particular, not only the business park, but also our entire coastline. And in particular, Plum Island. And so you'll see some visual on that tonight as well in a little bit more greater detail. One other thing I would note is the access to Plum Island. So we see here in this photograph, just examples of that, just as again, present day, Parker Street, this is flooding into or access to the business park. The map here, and this, I want to thank John Eric White, our city engineer, for this great illustration. For those of you who look at the aerial photographs of the city as much as I do, you might be familiar with things. But if you're looking at this map, you can make out the Route 1 traffic circle down here. And then you have the entire business park is really this whole area I'm surrounding with my mouse. So that's a fair area of the city. And as you can see here in different scenarios, including FEMA's flood zones at current day out to 2100, you can see basically how that situation gets exacerbated or is it projected to be exacerbated in the future. And so that's why we are planning for the future for this. We're trying to make sure that the actions we take in the coming years will help to prepare the city for that. And this is very common in other places in the world. City of Boston, obviously being a large city close to dealing with this issue, but it's a global issue, the flooding and sea level rise issues. So this is not new, but we do need to plan for it like other coastal communities. So this visual right here, this is downtown Newburyport, obviously. This photograph was taken of the old Black Cow building. It's obviously now been reused again as another restaurant, but as you can see, this is the boardwalk being washed over with waters. Market Square, so the entire downtown area can at times have flooding, and some of that is due to backups, but for the most part, that can happen right, just sheet flow right from the Merrimack River. We have Cashman Park, again, along our coastline. And this is the area near Joppa. So you'll notice the stone bollards there facing the water there. There's water that washes over there, of course. And so this is actually a primary road of access, of course. But that area does get flooded as well occasionally. And again, is projected to get worse in coming years or decades. This image right here, if you can imagine that north is actually on the bottom of this visual, south is at the top. This is Joppa, the coastline here. And so what you see is different features are mentioned in there. We have some other visuals that are aerial photographs, but this just shows during different hurricane scenarios, pushing inward, essentially inland, certain features and how they get impacted by those storms, in those category storms. So as you can see, our wastewater treatment facility there on the right, the Joppa Park seawall, the boat ramp, Water Street itself, and then, further inland even. With this visual right here, what I wanted to point out was just a little bit better. This is an aerial photograph of the wastewater treatment facility area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bound a couple of things just for your clarification. That's Water Street, the alignment of it roughly, and the wastewater treatment facility is there. And so as we think about infrastructure that we have that's very important, the wastewater treatment facility is perhaps our most vulnerable piece of infrastructure right now as a result of projected climate change and sea level rise. So as some of you know, we're undertaking tasks right now, to protect that plant from future sea level rise and storm surge. But this map just helps to illustrate, looking at several different time sequences. As time goes forward, the hazards and the probability of inundation of that treatment plant become more severe. And so that is why we're planning for that with, as you'll see in some visuals further on, why we're planning for the protection of that plant. Projected sea level rise at Plum Island, again, along the coastline. So there's another visual here just showing projecting inland what happens during various different mean high waters, that's the MHW, plus the sea level rise scenario. So this is, stepping out from 2050 to 2070 to 2100. And as you can see, the waters move progressively inland. And so that's why there's a vulnerability. It's not one area of Plum Island, it is extensive. And that's something that these visuals help us to all understand. The current erosion that's happening on the dune, by the way, is approximately there, just for folks who want to visualize that. Projected sea level rise in the access to Plum Island. So this is the Turnpike, the Plum Island Turnpike. I won't go through this visual in great detail because you can see the same color coding, but this visual helps to show that the access itself to Plum Island will be progressively more difficult to manage because of the frequency of storms and their intensity. This visual I want to credit to Horsley Witten, who has been working on the Plum Island MVP study. This study, there'll be a series of public meetings that will be coming as a result of those efforts. It is a joint effort between some consultants and the town of Newbury and the city of Newburyport to look at what is essentially fiscal implications of sea level rise on Plum Island, the climate change and sea level rise on Plum Island. And what this visual points out is what I was pointing out earlier, which is that there are certain neighborhoods that over time on Plum Island, as we progress with higher sea level and more storm surge pushing inland, that certain neighborhoods, certain areas of Plum Island will become hard to reach or become inaccessible, sometimes occasionally, sometimes more frequently. And so we need to look at this comprehensively and recognize that it isn't just the access point, it isn't just the center, it isn't just up at the North Point or on Reservation Terrace. It is a network of streets out there, relatively low lying near the ocean. And so there's different ways that water can move inland. And so I would urge you all to follow the process that will be unfolding the coming weeks or months with that study and the public meetings that will be about that. The impeded access to Plum Island, this is just a visual that was taken years ago just to show this is actually on the Turnpike. So this is our emergency crews needing to get out there in an emergency. This is the access they have to get. So keep in mind that when we talk about these maps, this is the ground level view of what that looks like. Again, the major drag right through as we move into Plum Island. You can see in these visuals, a fair amount of flooding happening in that main access drag. So imagine emergency crews getting out there, folks who need to move around the island. Again, these situations are projected to get more frequent and worse, and that is what we are trying to plan for here. This visual just helps to show, this is actually on the Newbury side, but it helps to show on the coastline. If you watch this visual and the one that follows it, this is a house that we have some similar issues, though not quite as severe as this particular one. We do have some severe erosion issues out on the island right now, and I know that the mayor and others have been working hard to try to get support for and assistance to protect the homes that are out there and the infrastructure. But we will continue as the city of Newburyport and the town of Newbury, sharing the island, to face the difficulties of nature, relentless, and recognizing that this island was naturally a barrier beach, something that would move over time. The sands would move over time. And so we're continually facing that battle with nature, trying to preserve infrastructure infrastructure out there, public and private. So in this visual here, you can see one house that's struggling to maintain, on the shore, and you have the concrete blocks, and you have the other elements meant to try to preserve that. And in the subsequent photo here, you can see that unfortunately that house was lost. There were some others at the time as well, and we are hoping to avoid a similar pattern of losses here in Newburyport as we deal with the current erosion issues, but even in the future with sea level rise and more storm surge. So this photograph here, actually taken in really present day condition with some of the erosion that's happened. You can see in this photograph attempts to protect from nature, something that will continue on indefinitely. You can see the plywood on the building there on the openings. You can see the plastic fiber bags with sand and meant to protect the homes. You can see some of them beyond the concrete blocks, by the way, which were there originally and are pretty heavy. The shredded bags, the bags that had been what we call sacrificial. They had done their job to try to protect during a storm, but had been lost or obliterated in the process because nature is so powerful. So in these visuals here, what you're seeing is some of the present day sea level rise and storm surge scenarios. Admittedly, some of this may be related to the jetty and its design and so forth. However, keep in mind that this pattern has been happening in various different areas along the coastline of Newburyport's Plum Island and in Newbury for a long time. This is not new, and it's not just the result of the jetty for certain. So this is an aerial photograph. I want to credit the Public Services Department for this image to show, again, the concrete blocks that were there. You can see some of them have shifted and moved. You can see the bags that are out there shredded a bit, some of them still surviving a bit. And you can see smaller sandbags, the black dots, folks trying to better protect near their homes. One thing I would suggest folks just pay attention to in the background is not the immediate house, which is obviously in some jeopardy there, but also the one behind it, the one that's right next to the roadway there. In this next photograph, you'll see that house. That house has, as you can see, the sand's been pushed right up against the house and into the windows and openings and so forth. So it's this water, once it reaches the dune, is able to move landward. And so, and doesn't have much of an obstacle. There's not a lot of topography on Plum Island to stop the water flow once it gets there. So whether it's from, an ancillary side effect of work on the jetty or erosion that's happening because of nature, these patterns will continue and we're projected to get worse. So what we need to recognize is that public and private infrastructure is out there and in some of that hazardous way. And this photograph recently, again, illustrates some of that. So some of the adaptation strategies that we've talked about doing here are infrastructure installations and improvements, and we'll go through this with some visuals as well. Regulatory and administrative approaches. As land use planner, I typically think of that as zoning changes, for instance. Communication and education. So we'll have an example of that. We sometimes have flyers or brochures created, web pages and information distributed to our community, our constituents, all our residents, to make sure that everyone is aware and can be actively engaged in trying to mitigate, anything we can do to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And then mitigation through carbon footprint reduction. And that's something I know that Molly Embro, who's part of the Resiliency Committee tonight, has been working on a great deal over the years. And there's some slides about that as well. So this one, John Eric White, our city engineer, was helpful in just helping to point out here if you notice that circle there is a lower artichoke dam. So this is really, if you take Story Avenue all the way out towards West Newbury, you're going to see this lower artichoke dam. And because of the relatively small difference in that elevation there and the absence of any sort of gate or control, sea level rise can actually back things up and result in transfer of water that we may not necessarily find in the city's best interest in terms of public water supply, salt water and contaminants and so forth. So with that in mind, one thing that we might want to do in a situation like that, and again, as an infrastructure protection measure that we could take, is to put in a proposed floodgate at this location. So this is a sample of what something like that might look like, but its goal is to essentially prevent the rise in sea level or flooding from mixing water that we may not want to be mixed or inundating an area where we get our public water supply. And again, I would defer to others on greater detail about that, and certainly our city engineer, but that is in essence, one of the infrastructure improvements that we could do. The wastewater treatment facility, this is obviously an active protective measure we're taking right now. The mayor, Jordy Vining, folks from public services, a lot of effort was made in recent years to obtain funds from the state to help out with this. And so the recent, relatively recent, couple of years back, multi-million-dollar investments in the treatment plant need to be protected. So we're looking at that shoreline in this photograph here next to the treatment plant. Current day revetment wall, that's the stones there, being put in to protect that facility. And you'll see that the bike path obviously being roughly where the construction vehicle equipment is right now. That's where it will be on the inland side. But that revetment, that stone revetment, and the raise of elevation by a few feet is what's intended to protect our treatment plant for the foreseeable future. Future measures may be needed, in the long term, but this is definitely an active measure we're taking today as a capital project. I would note, by the way, that the efforts that were made by folks to date, Molly, the Resiliency Committee, the municipal vulnerability preparedness exercises, all made us eligible for really $1 million towards that project from the state, something that we would not have been eligible for if we had not done the advanced planning efforts and recognizing these vulnerabilities. Infrastructure protection. So again, you see in this photograph here, the wastewater treatment plant. And you also see the National Grid substation. So you just want to see the relative close proximity of those two facilities along the coastline there. And there's some similarities about the need to protect those facilities, one being for the treating of wastewater for the city of Newburyport, town of Newbury, portions of West Newbury, an extensive area, with lots of public and private properties and businesses and homes tied into it. And then you have the electrical system, same need. So for that area there, this photograph just blowing in to that area shows, if you look at the top right corner of the screen, you'll see the electrical substation equipment. You can see our bike path towards the bottom there, looping around, our bike path going through there through the easement. And then you can see the stone revetment work that they had done. Admittedly, this project is not the longest term scenario. They will need to do some additional improvements. But as you can see, there's some improvements that they have done and we'll probably need to do more of in the coming years to protect that plant in the future, similar to what we are doing at our treatment plant. And so in this next photograph, this is not the substation facility, but it's an example of the type of structures that are sometimes put around electrical substations or facilities like that to protect them. So what you'll see here is essentially a wall type structure. It's a sort of a retaining wall, fence-like structure. However, the gates that provide access can be temporarily filled with barriers that are placed prior to storm events. So this provides access for equipment that need to get them in and out, vehicles, but for the most part, there is essentially a protective wall above any revetment walls. So this is one scenario that we may see National Grid look into in the future to protect that plant or that facility. Now I'm just going to take a moment to show a couple of slides about development patterns. This is really focused primarily on Plum Island. There are other areas of the city that are vulnerable due to their proximity to the coastline. But one of the, as land use planner, chief land use planner for the city, this one touches a number of the permits that I've seen over the years on Plum Island, recent permitting and expansions and so forth there. And what you'll see from the slides you just saw and these images you're seeing now is the contrast between what I would show as further growth, and you'll see that through these images, some further growth on the island happening while we're also dealing with some erosion currently, but also, as the main point of this presentation is, changes that will be happening that are larger than Newburyport, larger than we can affect any direct change to. We can mitigate the impacts of climate change, but and we can certainly reduce, for instance, our greenhouse gas emissions, the global picture, but we will have to adapt and recognize that some of these changes, sea level rise and storm surge are going to happen. So the reason I mentioned that is because with these next slides, you're going to be seeing continual growth on the island is sometimes at odds with the concerns we express about the vulnerability of those same homes that are on the island. So in this image right here, this was maybe a year or two ago, a development was making reference to a developer or attorney during permitting on the island was making reference to this property and suggesting that this might be an example of an expansion on the island that was not detrimental to the island, not detrimental to the purposes of the island with zoning, which is largely to mitigate or reduce impacts from development and growth, if you will. So that seems like a contradiction to me, I guess, as planning director. So just to show you a visual of the types of homes that folks are building, there are some small cottages and were historically on the island, but we're seeing larger expansions now on the island. And so that puts some of that public and private infrastructure in hazard's way. So in this image right here, there's just be, I think, 2 more of these. You'll see it on the left side for comparison, the original house that was being looked at for redevelopment, and then the proposed house, and these are all essentially approved projects. Notably, the house there on the right there, the proposed house, is raising the structure out of the hazard's way. That's arguably a good thing. It doesn't necessarily deal with the fact that the house is still on an island that might have access issues, but it does raise the house, the habitable area at least, out of the hazard zone. And so that's something that I think generally is the pattern of supporting that sort of effort. The one thing I would note, and the reason I call out these examples, is just because the size of those homes, the number of bedrooms or the square footage, and the expectations, whether it's a rental house or a full-time resident, the expectation that folks are going to be living out there more folks, longer periods of time or throughout the year. While we know that sea level rise and hazards are going to be increasing, that's the reason for just keeping note about the size increases in some of these projects. So again, on the left side, you'll see the existing small shack or structure that was there, and ultimately what was going to be approved on the other side. It's a little hard to make out, but there's on the upper image on the right, there is a ramp for vehicles to access a garage in the raised structure. And then you can see the 2-level structure, windows, and doors for comparison. You can get a sense of the order of magnitude or size of a structure being placed out there in lieu of what's there today. So beyond regulatory changes, we have community education, and that's obviously what we're doing tonight. We're making an effort to make sure that the community as a large understands what this plan shows, what the vulnerabilities and strategies are that we need to take into account. This presentation is a way of sort of encapsulating some of that for a quick digestion. But if folks want to see that information on the website, it's obviously there. This is an example of something we might do to get, say, a flyer out or an email blast out to some of the folks who subscribe to the city's newsletters and so forth. Get it out via social media to let people know that in this scenario, this was discussing how to keep Plum Island beautiful. And it was sort of thinking about the types of things to keep in mind, whether you're going to have an impact and how you can minimize your impacts. So we've done a couple of these flyers before, but this is an example of sort of a quick infographic that we can send out there to let folks know that aren't, attending this meeting. We have 70 or so folks attending this evening, but to let a broader number of folks understand the priorities expressed in this plan and what we can do, and to make sure that the whole community is engaged in mitigating the impacts of climate change. So carbon footprint reduction, the next series of slides is really just about the comparison between, as a community, both individually as members, but also collectively as a community, we emit greenhouse gases. And so this chart, I want to thank Molly Ember for, it shows some of the distribution of where that's coming from. I won't go into it in great detail. I'll let the numbers sort of speak for themselves, but you get a sense of the total metric tons equivalent that we're generating and where some of that actually comes from. Obviously, we hear a lot, or have heard in recent years and decades, about transportation being a source of greenhouse gases. There's the homes, there's the use of electricity, and then there's some other miscellaneous items in there. So one of the things that I know that the mayor and Molly have been working on in recent years is where we source and purchase our energy from. And this is, in essence, trying to assure that when we are drawing energy, we're pulling it from renewable sources. So in this scenario, you can see 2 scenarios: the water and sewer department, where they're sourcing some of their electricity in terms of billing, the school department from a facility in Western Mass. And even if we can't locate the facilities here in Newburyport, to be able to pull from renewable energy sources helps Newburyport to be a net zero or closer to a net zero community. So that's, I want to applaud them for all the efforts that have been made in that regard. This is the solar installation at the Knockmullen School. And there's also energy efficiencies that have been put into capital projects we've been making on municipal facilities. But this shows that we can also generate our own electricity on the roof, obviously. And there are other places where folks, this happens to be at Endicott College, but at places where large surface parking lots can be covered with canopies that generate electricity, but also provide shade for cars and prevent snow piles and so forth. So, so there's benefits to doing this. There's initial investment for some of those improvements, but I think if we look at both our public lots and the private sector lots, there is certainly extensive shopping areas in Story Avenue area. If the more we have of these solar canopies, the more we reduce our impact because we're generating our electricity from renewable sources. So these are just examples again from other locations, but just to show where solar can be added to a roof. So if this was a maintenance facility of some type, it's not too hard to add some solar panels depending on the nature of the building. This is not here in Newburyport, obviously, but this is an example of solar panel or canopies put over parking. And we have some examples of that here in Newburyport. This is for aerial photograph. It's a little easier to show the rooftop as well. On the right, what you're seeing here is the Hillside Center for Sustainability. It's a redevelopment scheme that's largely based or entirely based on the idea of trying to be sustainable in terms of the homes and the footprint. And so what you're seeing here is on the left side, the homes, the units that they're attached there have solar panels on the roof. And then on the left side, what you're seeing, those large blocks are the solar panels above the parking spots. Again, taking advantage of every available or reasonably available space to generate solar energy to offset what would be used in electricity for the facilities that are being built. So I want to applaud David Hall and those folks for doing that. I think those types of projects should be encouraged more in the future. This is a, for carbon footprint reduction. This is solar panel installations. This happens both at homes and businesses. Two that are shown here at Brown Square, a small business. You can see a panel being installed there up on the roof. And you can see the rooftop at the Tannery Marketplace, similar to the Knockmullen School. You see that they have some solar panels up on the roof there to reduce their draw from greenhouse gas emitting fuel sources. Again, the mayor and Molly and other city departments, the efforts that have been made in recent years. In our parking garage, you'll see here on the left, we have electric vehicles. This is the parking enforcement vehicle, electric charging, and the stations themselves in the garage to be charging those vehicles, both our own city vehicles as well as the public. So there's a few spaces lined up there for those charging stations. We have run conduits for additional spaces to expand that as EV vehicles expand more in the market. And we have on the right there, the senior center, the senior community center also has those charging stations. Again, we always think about carbon footprint reduction. We often think of electricity usage, for instance, but the waste that we emit, the trash and recycling is also an important component of that because it does take money, it actually costs money to dispose of those things, but it also can use energy. So to the extent we're recycling any materials we can that are plastics and things like that, as well as the food that can be recycled, that's that small, you get that small green container there. You know, you have those three elements, the trash, the recycling, and the food waste. Anything we can do to reuse those materials and put them back in the cycle again saves energy. So that's the Zero Waste Initiative. And I think Molly's best capable of speaking to that. She's part of our panelists tonight. But that is something that's also relevant for reducing our impact on greenhouse gases, which is really in large part the source of the notable source of climate change that we're trying to deflect. So with that, I'll ask Mayor Holaday to turn back on the implementation of the plan, and obviously we'll all collectively be working on some of that in the future, and then we'll turn to some public comment.
Thank you, Andy. Nice job of going over all of those slides and a lot of information, but we really tried to emphasize the visuals to really hit home in terms of what we're, looking at as a community and the work that needs to be done. So it really is important for us to focus on climate change and resiliency. There is a tremendous amount of work to do, but I think a lot of of this began with Molly's work with us becoming a green community, and then her energy advisory group, this ad hoc group, and there are other organizations like ACES that is working with our students. There's, clubs at the high school. So there really is I think a lot of interest and work that's happening across the city. It's really important that it involves all city departments. We're looking at net zero buildings, and when we have to develop new capital projects, ensuring that we're doing as much green initiatives as well as sustainable work. And we have also been very, very successful, number one, through the Green Communities Act, but also through becoming an MVP that David mentioned early on, the Municipal Vulnerabilities Preparedness Program. Not unlike the Green Communities Act, the MVP program required us to become a certified community first. And so we had a lot of work to do, just in terms of identifying our hazards and putting initial plans together, and then being accepted as an MVP community. Then we could apply for grants, and we did receive a grant to study how we could best protect the wastewater treatment plant. That was the first step in the MVP process. And then we were able to apply for an action grant, which Andy mentioned. We received $1 million grant, which was really significant for us to protect our $34 million investment in the wastewater treatment facility. Unfortunately, when that project was designed back in the mid 200s, it was way before we understood what we know now about storm surge and climate change. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention the great work that the storm surge has been doing, particularly bringing experts into our community and educating us on a variety of topical areas relating to storm surge and climate change. So these are really important efforts to continue with grant funding. We also need our personal adaptations, and I think that really reflects what each of us can do individually as a person in our community, to walk instead of drive, to bike, to walk, to think about your carbon footprint, to think about what you're doing in your household in terms of taking care of, as Andy showed, trash. Are you recycling to the max? Are you would encourage everyone to participate in our the little green buckets Andy talked about, the composting. I can't, we've been doing it now since the program started in our own family, and I can't believe how little trash we are putting out now between being able to divide that up. So there's a lot of things that each one of us can do. And then, of course, volunteer efforts. Really asked a lot of the people on this ad hoc resiliency committee over the past several years in putting this plan together. And as I said, I can't thank them enough for their hard work, their professionalism, and this really solid document that is the result of all this work. But now as we move forward and begin to look at additional grants, additional projects across the city, we're looking for additional volunteers to step up and who are willing to make a commitment to join our ad hoc resiliency group. So if you have an interest in this area and feel like you can make a commitment to a monthly meeting and being part of a task force to work on a particular project, I would greatly appreciate you sending an email to the mayor at cityofnewburyport.com. You can always find the link on our city website. And we really look forward to expanding, now that our plan is done, to expanding the outreach to more people in our community to step up and become part of this effort. So I think I covered all of that.
Thank you there. I just throwing up this slide because, well, again, this will be on the website. We did mention Donna Mazicki, who's the mayor's executive assistant. And
right, so you can send your interest to her or to mayor either way, it still works. I'll get it.
Correct. And thank you, Mayor. And So I obviously have to give a lot of deference to others who have spent a lot of time on their various efforts for this plan and this presentation. But we do want to open it up. Primarily what we're interested in hearing tonight is, after making sure you all understand what's in the plan, and if you're interested in getting involved, is to now open it up and hear what you have to say, if there's any questions or concerns that some of you folks have. So we're going to switch now to asking the public for to raise their hands, so to speak. This is the Zoom feature. This is, as you all know, I think from the pandemic situation, this is how we have to do our public meetings right now. And so what we're going to do is open it up to the audience. If you're interested in speaking, please use Zoom's raise hand feature, which should be a button at the bottom of your screen. If you click that, it will let us know that you're interested in speaking. We'd ask you to keep your comments brief, just in respect for the others that may also want to speak. We have the panelists here, of course. There are other folks in the audience I know who have been involved, and appreciate the presence of city council members and others. We'll go person by person, and I'll ask you to unmute. So the first person we have is identified as E. Grammer. If you'd like to unmute, you could address the panelists, and we can hopefully address any questions or concerns you might have.
My name is Lisa Grammer. I'm a resident of West Newbury, and I commend you on this incredible effort. I do have a question, though, regarding the water supply and the artichoke. I obviously know that West Newbury is the place where the artichoke is, and you have a lot of plans for it. And I'm wondering how much interaction and how much discussion there's been with West Newbury. And I look at, for instance, I think it's page 114 of the document that talks about looking at the wells that West Newbury has by the artichoke and whether or not they're drawing down too much water, which has been litigated by Newburyport and found without merit. That argument has already happened. And I know that West Newbury has a potential well site that could produce a lot of water. So I'm very interested in understanding how much discussion has been or will be occurring with West Newbury about sort of a shared issue and problem.
I think that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. And we're working with a contractor, engineering firm Ty & Bond, and I'm going to ask John Eric to step up at this point to give sort of a summary about what we're doing with the water supply and some of those efforts. John Eric, can you come on?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so Lisa, the firm that the mayor just alluded to, we hired them a year ago, and their responsibility right now is to evaluate our current water management, watershed protection reports, and look at our water supply for impacts with climate change. During that effort, there are 5 scope items for them to work on. And one of them is to work with West Newbury to come up with a watershed protection plan. We've looked at the location of your wellhead right against the artichoke. We've looked at that. I'm not particularly involved with past litigation with that, so I'm going to refrain from that. But what we are doing, we've been working with the town manager, Angus Jennings, and we have a very good rapport with you guys. We have a lot of effort to continue. We're going to go through public meetings with you folks. It's a shared duty to keep the watershed clean. We have a lot of ideas. I can go on and on and on. And right now, the number one effort is getting a new raw water line from Indian Hill Reservoir down to our pump station. That's the biggest capital improvement project that we're anticipating to come out of that. The other one is raising the dam. That's in your half of it's in your town. We have worked with. We had a meeting with Angus, City of Newburyport, and folks from your side, Angus and his water department, Mike Goutet, and your legal representative. We discussed the possibility of looking at getting some I don't want to say purchase, but sharing the potential water supply that you're alluded to for that new source. I think it's on Dole Street or over on Dole. We're looking at that. We want to keep our door open. Every community wants to keep the door open for water supply because climate change is going to impact everyone's water supply worldwide. So that's a long-term effort amongst yourselves and in combination with us, because our city does provide you with a small percentage of your water supply. So there is a shared desire to keep that open. I hope that answers your question. If you have any more, please let me know.
Hey, thanks for the question. Next person that we have that's raised a hand is Vernon Ellis.
Hi. Are you and Newbury and the state and probably the federal government making any plans for a planned retreat from Plum Island?
Well, that's a great question. I obviously allow others to speak as well on this, but there have been discussions about possibly if there's a possibility of buying out certain houses that really should not necessarily be there in the future. But as to a comprehensive retreat plan, there isn't anything in the works right now that would suggest a wholesale, acquisition of properties or demolition of houses that are in hazard-prone locations, if you will. I think that will happen probably more incrementally. Unfortunately, the pattern that I've seen suggests that folks will, because it is such a prized location along the water, that some of that will happen because folks are willing to take the risk that they may not be the next home. But it is a dialogue that we are having. Whether or not folks that have properties are interested or willing to go along with a retreat style approach, that is difficult, frankly. I think from what I have seen, and this is not just for Newburyport, it is difficult for folks who have invested in coastline properties, for instance, who have great views potentially from those locations, to give that up and sort of walk away from that. However, the risks are real, and it's a valid question to ask. I can't say that there's a comprehensive plan for a retreat at this point. The area that I am focused on at this point in terms of trying to make some regulatory changes or changes in permitting is to at least reduce or stop the amount of growth that's happening in those hazard prone areas. So while that's not necessarily a retreat in the truest sense, it is at least curbing the potential risks, if you will. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that.
I'll jump in, Andy, at this point. Vernon, you know all too well about the risks of having previously owned a home on Plum Island. So given the storm of February 1st, and as you know, we've been struggling with the state for many, many years since the redesign of the jetty, and the fact that the state owns the beach along Reservation Terrace up, through the North Point parking lot. And we've been having really real conversations at this point about homes that are at great risk and whether or not there can be a buyout or other mitigation. One of the things that FEMA requires is our all hazardous plan has to be up to date, and that expires the end of May. So we're having active conversations about how we can still stay in line for this program with FEMA MEMA. And Julia Gottfredson, as you know, our conservation administrator, will be working diligently over the next many weeks to try and get up to speed with this very complex program with FEMA MEMA. But we have to have, I think, every tool available to us in terms of helping homeowners and protecting our infrastructure out there. And this is one that I'm hoping that we will be able to, offer as an option to homeowners as we go forward. Important question, Vernon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Peter Fitzsimmons, if you'd like to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I had a question about the flooding of the lower Artichoke Reservoir. If that should flood and the reservoir became unusable, is there any thought to building putting in a pipeline directly to the upper Artichoke or Indian Hill from the pump station, sort of bypass of the lower Artichoke, so that you'd have access to clean water?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think John Eric is our city engineer is best able to speak to that. And I know it's an issue that he and our water treatment plant supervisor are looking into in great detail right now, with, like the mayor said, with tie and bond. John Eric, do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. So right now I'm answering these questions, but it's a collaborative effort with the water treatment plant operator, Tom Kuzik. In general, right now it's in the design phase, Mr. Fitzsimmons. So Tie and Bond has put together conceptual layouts for, I think we have 6 or 7 different routes from Indian Hill Reservoir down to the pump station on Route 113. The majority, half of them go cross country, the other half on the road. There's pros and cons of all of them. We think our final proposal will be via the road for a lot of reasons. However, that'll require a pump station. The cross country will require, that'll be via gravity, but we have issues with that. So we are looking at that. It's a great idea, great question. And what that does is it serves exactly the purpose you said. When the lower and upper artichokes are not being able to be used, whether it's an algae bloom or a breach of the dam, we can keep that tap going. On that note, Mr. Fitzsimmons, I also want to let you know we're currently in the permitting phase with the Conservation Commission in West Newbury. The lower Artichoke Dam is primarily the majority of the dam. The majority of the spillway is in West Newbury. We've designed a foundation to prepare for us to install the equivalent of sandbags. We could do aqua dams, which is a trademark, not to call them out, or the large sacks. The reason for that is that'll give us the ability, if we get a storm this hurricane season, we can at least get the foundation in so that Tom's crews can install sandbags. So yes, we have a proposed water line from Indian Hill, and 2, we do have an emergency plan right now to put up sandbags at the reservoir.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, John Eric. Do we have anyone else who'd like to ask any questions this evening or speak? Looks like we do. Kate Murray.
My question has to do with whether there are any discussions underway regarding zoning changes that might be needed to respond to these sea level rise projections, particularly, for example, development along the Merrimack River, Waterfront West. Should we be reducing or even prohibiting new structures and hardscape in vulnerable areas within Newburyport?
Well, thank you. As planning director, I'm probably the best person to speak to that. Thank you for asking that question. There's definitely a tie in there. There is actually at the next city council meeting, there has been submitted and will be, I assume, referred to committee for review, a draft zoning change for Plum Island, one area that has a particular hazard in sea level rise and storm surge and flooding. Because that area really stands out in the city of Newburyport as a particular vulnerability. The idea with that zoning change in a nutshell, and I do want to thank Councilor Connell for sponsoring that to at least get that in the docket to committee for consideration. That change would effectively send a stronger message to the Zoning Board of Appeals, which is typically the board looking at permits and modifications on the island, that aren't essentially completely as of right. And the idea behind that zoning change is it would call for not any expansion in really the square footage of homes, not new additional bedrooms, not new sprawling footprints of those structures in the future. Given that all of those would exacerbate the conditions we have today with flooding, with damaging the dunes, or additional demand on a vulnerable sewer and water system out there. So that being the case, that we are mobilizing for at least the council's consideration of a zoning change that would address some of that on Plum Island. The other areas of the city that you mentioned, they are equally, I'd say Plum Island certainly has the strongest risk. From what I can see of the maps, the coastline has a similar issue. And you mentioned Waterfront West. I know Waterfront West during the last couple of years when that was discussed for rezoning, we did talk about sea level rise, and I want to thank the Resiliency Committee and some others for focusing on that issue with the planning board and my office, and we did get some plans that were discussed with the development team from a new development in that scenario. And there was discussion about essentially raising any of the development, the infrastructure, the public infrastructure there, the private infrastructure out of the hazard zone, meaning raising it elevation wise. That doesn't answer completely all the questions about that, but that has been discussed in that context for Waterfront West, recognizing that it needs to be addressed as part of any redevelopment of that property. It's fairly unlikely we're going to be picking up and moving our historic downtown. So I think it should be recognized that that is a part of the downtown, and we'll probably have some type of redevelopment on it, in the future. But it is logical for us to consider sea level rise and storm surge as part of that. And so I know that I want to thank John Eric and the folks who spent some time looking at that issue with us. So we do know that's an issue that needs to be addressed for that area. There are other areas of the city along the coastline that we need to look at. I think we're dealing with, like I said, at present, focusing on Plum Island, but then we'll need to look to those other areas as well. The business park, for instance. Yes, sorry.
Oh, sorry. When you're done, I'll just add a little extra piece to your answer.
Oh, no, go right ahead. I think I was sort of wrapping up, so go ahead if you want to add something.
Okay, I just
Julia,
wanted to add.
By the way.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, I'm the Conservation Administrator. And about a year ago, the Conservation Commission, although it's not a zoning change per se, the Conservation Commission adopted new regulations under our local wetlands protection ordinance. And the new regulations we adopted are for the coastal floodplain specifically. So that covers the coastal floodplain, whether it's on Plum Island or on the mainland. And the new regulations require any development to take sea level rise into consideration prior to submitting plans for approval. So again, it's not a zoning change, but it was what we could do as a Conservation Commission to begin the process of requiring all development on the floodplain to take sea level rise into consideration. That's it.
Thanks, Julia. Does that answer your question, Kate?
I'm wondering when the Conservation Commission will take up this discussion about Waterfront West.
I would not envision this calendar year there being a heavy discussion of that matter, only because we don't have any pressing development scheme that's being brought forward for that. It is, I know the planning board has recently expressed some interest in having, picking up the dialogue again about zoning changes for that area, separate from any Conservation Commission jurisdiction or regulations. But I'm not sure that will be, just given the number of other issues going on, the bandwidth and the unlikelihood, less than likelihood of some development scheme coming forward during the next year. That's more likely to proceed, I think, maybe in next year, I would say, calendar wise, if you want to look for a realistic time frame. But it is definitely on our radar. And I know that the Conservation Commission would be looking at that, as well as the Planning Board and City Council with respect to zoning. Beyond that, I don't know if Julia could offer anything.
Well, I can just add one other piece to that, Kate. I think there was so much pushback, negative pushback from our community at their public presentations of their plans, even though they, tried to tweak it several times going forward. And then they sort of walked away. met a year ago, January, in Boston at NED's office to talk about where they were and what their plans were. I mean, for us, the city really wants a hotel. And they're, obviously that's, the least of their priorities for that site, even though they know they have to put one there if they're going to develop there. But we haven't had any conversations with them in well over a year in terms of what they're thinking about or planning based on all the feedback they received from the community, the planning board, city councilors regarding that site. And I think that this committee put together a really comprehensive list of things that they were required to do to address storm surge. So I know that this conversation will pick up again should they come back and start introducing changes to their conceptual plan or whatever. And Julia, I think you wanted to add something?
Oh, no, Mayor, you and Andy both covered it. Thank you. But again, it will come before the Conservation Commission eventually when they finally submit their development plans, just as it will go before the planning board and zoning as well. We just haven't reached that point yet. So thank you.
Andy, I have a suggestion or a comment, if it's okay. So Andy, for Kate, one additional answer for her. I don't know if during the meetings that the mayor alluded to, our resiliency committee put together the subcommittee. Remember that?
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say the same. Yep.
Yeah. So I think this is appropriate to bring this up.
Yeah.
So Kate, we created a subcommittee, and do you have the slide? Is this okay, Andy? Do you have the slide for that?
Sure, go ahead. I'll pull it up.
Yeah, and that's the so on the second page, Andy, with the subcommittee members. I'm not bringing this up to pat us on the back. I just want people to know that this group, it's made up of engineers, and Mike Morris is extremely knowledgeable with many things related to storm surge. So it's myself, Diane Gagnon, the assistant engineer, John O'Connell, another engineer, Bill Mullen, hydraulic engineer, and Mike Morris. So what we came up with was, we determined that a reasonable sea level rise height for the Waterfront West should be 6 feet. And what that's based on, if you go to the next page, our logic, next page, one more page. Yeah, right there. So our main logic was to use FEMA and add sea level rise to it. And the reason for that is FEMA is always changing their base flood elevation. So rather than have us tell a developer an exact number right now, we figured as projects go on, Waterfront West, we did give them a number, yes, but it's today's FEMA plus 6 feet. But this also could apply for other properties. So we use FEMA base flood elevation, and that is 12 and 13. If you go to the next page, 12 and 13 for, you can stay on this page, Andy. 12 and 13 for the Waterfront West, plus 6, puts their first floor at 18 and 19 feet. Now, we presented that to them. They came back with a redesign, and if I'm not mistaken, everyone on the panel, if I'm not mistaken, they were willing to work with it. I had some issues with details of that. I'm always one that wants more, but in general, I felt like I wanted people to know that we did recommend that they should use a 6 foot sea level rise in their design.
Yeah, thank you, John Eric, very much for that reference and overview of that discussion and the important role that the Resiliency Committee took in looking at that in greater detail, again, rather than just looking at the developer's consulting opinion, on how to address those issues. The one additional note I would make about that, to add the great background that John Eric provided, was just that when the development scheme, when the developer had agreed to use that, as the baseline, if you will, that seemed a reasonable approach. That really raised the habitable spaces, if you will, out of the hazard zones. The one area that was still left for some debate in how that would be addressed and what the impacts would be long term is parking areas that would be potentially inundated by water, not habitable spaces, of course, but periodically inundated by water based on the frequency of storms and their intensity. So despite raising elevations or putting walls and so forth. So at any rate, I know in that scenario, the even if the habitable spaces, commercial and residential, are raised out of the hazard zone, there still may be some discussion or debate about what impact parking areas can take and how frequently that they may be inundated based on future scenarios.
Okay, so stay tuned, right?
You're muted, Andy.
You're muted, Andy.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, sorry, I was doing a good job of trying to mute myself. Yeah, so like I said, stay tuned, but I would not expect a discussion of that in great detail before any board or committee this year, just based on other things that are going on.
Thank you very much.
You're muted again, Andy.
Councillor Connell, apologies. Would you like to address the group? And you'll need to unmute as well, as I've been mistakenly forgetting to do.
Can you hear me now?
We
Yes.
can, thank you.
Oh, good, thanks. Yeah, I don't know how many people, because my screen doesn't display how many people are listening to this conversation right now. But I appreciate the fact that
62.
62. So there is a lot of interest here, and that's encouraging. The somewhat daunting problem we face from a council perspective, and I'm just speaking for myself as one, I'm not speaking for the entire council, is that at some point we have to establish some priorities in terms of which of our public infrastructures do we spend money on protecting and hardening against sea level rise and the impacts of climate change? Which do we harden up and expend money to protect first, second, third, etc.? And clearly we've taken a step with the assistance of some outside funding agencies to harden up our wastewater treatment plant. That's a no-brainer. However, our water treatment facility, although it's not widely known or very visible to people because it's not in the downtown area, is also problematic. What is next? Is that next? Is the next step to try to prevent the surge of water up into our industrial zone in the Dexter Park, where there are a lot of jobs, about 2,000 jobs out there? Should that be next? Should we instead focus on the downtown and putting check valves in the drainage system that takes storm water out of the downtown area so that it's not backed up from the riverside into the downtown, flooding those businesses and all of the investment, many millions of dollars that have been spent to make our downtown commercial district as attractive as it is. So my only point in speaking really is to ask folks to think about these things and to talk to their city councilors and share their thoughts. We're not sure what's next. We have a lot of things on our plate. There are all sorts of capital expenditures that we would like to make. We need a new fire station. There's some concern about where the Parks Commission is going to store its equipment, where the youth services should be, et cetera, et cetera. But my point, though, is that this has to be part of that discussion. The Resiliency Committee has done a terrific job. I've just been a bit player watching from the sidelines primarily. Mike Morris and Dave Chatfield and others have spent a huge amount of time and effort giving us useful information. But as we make decisions, we need some feedback from people. What are you willing to pay for? And what's the most important thing? What's secondary? What's tertiary? Let's see if we can start to line things up and plan for things instead of just react to them when they wash over us. And that's it for now.
Thank you, Counselor. I really appreciate those points you've made. Next person we have is Peter Smith. Peter, if you would like to unmute yourself, you should be able to address the group. Give a moment to see if you can, I'm not sure if you're having an audio issue on your end. Doesn't look like Peter's able to get a microphone connection, perhaps.
I think David wanted to speak.
David, go right ahead.
Yes, one thing that I'd like to talk about and build on what Barry has spoken about is this is a presentation on the overall, an overview of the problems and some of the implementation that's been done. You know, we are going to have to look at communication issues, and I think there's going to be a rollout to all manner of different stakeholders where the presentations / discussions are much more focused. So, you know, you can think of the stakeholders. It could be the downtown retail group. It could be the industrial park. It could be the chamber as a whole. It could be realtors. It could be the water situation with West Newbury. Obviously, there's some groups already on Plum Island looking at the detailed problems. I think as we roll things out, we can get more views in. And we also need to get more information out, because managed retreat was talked about, or retreat was talked about earlier on. And for the most part, that's an individual resident's decision as to what point is their risk value balance impacted? At what point do they want to move out of a flood zone? And in order to make that decision, they need information. And I think that the state, I think the city, I think the agencies have now got some good models to tell you what risks you're running. Nobody can tell you for certain, but they can give you some clues as to how to make those decisions. The other personal adaptations that I think people can make are planning for the disasters so that you are prepared for that disaster. I know Storm Surge has done some excellent work on personal emergency plans, but those need to be more personal. What are you going to do if it's this kind of scenario? So communication, I think, is going to be seen, is not this one-off presentation. It's going to have to be for specific stakeholders, and it's a two-way street, and we need it. There's lots of this elephant that we can all take a little piece of and work on. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? If there aren't, that's fine too. We like I said, we will be posting these slides to the website, and we appreciate everybody else looking at the plan and the information in there in greater detail. And then if you're interested in getting involved, as it's mentioned in the presentation, just reach out to the mayor's office.
Thank you all. Thank you, members of this ad hoc committee. I can't even begin to thank you enough for the hours and hours and hours you have devoted to create this very, very important plan for the city. I thank you all, and please keep the questions, comments, and even if you're interested in just working on one particular piece, let us know, because that's something that, you know, that could happen through this, ad hoc group, where a subtask group is, a subgroup is set up, you know, as we did to deal with the Waterfront West development. We certainly can work on, individual groups if you're interested in a very particular project. Again, can't thank you enough for being here. This is only the beginning, our first presentation, and there will be many more to come. Thank you all. Stay safe, be healthy, and get your cars off the street, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.